Maurice of Nassau or Gustavus Adolphus, they didn't really invent much, right? Most of the stuff they were credited with either already existed or was fully integrated way after their own deaths even, and they were just great commanders who, of course, had very efficient armies that had shaped themselves and through their own officers, and this important, in fact, um, civilian support. Think about Oxenstierna for Gustavus Adolphus. We're not talking just about French money in that regard. And given that the function develops the organ in many ways, of course, they were to very high standards, but it was not actually a real reform, especially as far as the art of war was concerned. It was mostly a matter of state building or of organization, of availability of resources, and just what followed from the necessities of ever greater coordination on a large collective scale, right? While Louvois, that is not really, say, he is a very famous figure, but is not compared in a military sense, if anything, because he wasn't like a commander himself, was more a man of state, doesn't deserve the credit of literally creating all this out of scratch, right? I mean, making the most powerful army of the time, but by far superior to anything any other country had at that point, and maintaining the standards and the legacy that lives to this very day in the world militaries. Well, that's a figure that would deserve a bit more of a recognition, and hopefully also reminding people what is that really makes the difference, militarily speaking. When you have to substantiate properly a military policy and strategic accomplishments. As far as the rank of colonel, with the annexed ownership of the regiment, as we've seen, this remained the subject of trade between nobles. It was not so important to eliminate this aspect, but the effective command of the regiments was actually stripped from them. This is quite interesting, because basically these noblemen came just to finance the regiments, because they also were deemed responsible for their standards. But the regiment itself was now being administered by a professional soldier with ranks that were created ad hoc in the French army. It is lieutenant colonel, commander of the regiment, with the majors commanding the battalions formed. And this was quite important because, again, essentially kept, say, nobility or prestige at a merely financial level, but at the same time ensured that the money employed to buy these forces that were still thus quite important to provide to the same king as a form of individual promotion, were taken care of by professional military, and not by the nobility that mostly rose, let's say, in the ranks in the form of commanders, right, that still remained fundamentally at the top, and still was essentially a lesser nobility that made most of the job. At least this is how the 18th century worked like, whereas, of course, the nobility in Versailles was ever more distant from the battlefields. But it was still a very effective system. This reform was completed in 1667, when Louis also created the rank of brigadier general, was a senior officer commanding multiple regiments. And Louis decreed that lieutenant colonels could also access this post, thus establishing an internal army route of merit-based promotion for the most gifted officers, regardless of their nobility or wealth. And at the same time, given the army a solid and especially professional backbone. So this was a way to essentially attract the nobility towards ever more administrative tasks, and leaving the actually the burden also of the military competence to people who had already, earned that experience, and thus were also the most useful, the most skilled ones that, on the field would use this regiment better. And so this, of course, brings the nobility, including the king, ever more distant from a direct military involvement on the field. But this is, of course, motivated by the political social needs of the great state. Like Francis I of France, as we've seen in a video we made recently on the Landsknecht, could even want to die and was captured in combat like any other knight. The century before Louis XIV. The Sun King instead was, in fact, the state himself, and he could not risk so much. This was something that was starting being noted since the Middle Ages, that it was a bit better for the king not to risk even survival for the many battles, the wars, etc. But of course, a lot of ethos, as we've seen, was present among the nobility of the time. So many of these professional officers could be noblemen themselves, and were often noblemen, right? Because they were provided finally with an adequate pay that would also essentially give them some chance even of promotion socially, paradoxically, because again the French nobility was pretty stratified from since medieval times, let's say. So being a nobleman, even though it was somehow just a tiny part of the population, didn't necessarily mean to be particularly powerful, and the military service could and would actually provide with an interesting opportunity, also economically. I made a video last year about 18th century French officers' appointment, in which we explained more or less what was going on. There were lots of bourgeois, we will see them now, that were essentially joining the army as well, thanks to these reforms. And there was a broader criticism, as you know, towards the nobility as a sort of, say, estate consciousness, because this wasn't just a military matter, but de facto, the high quality, the very high level of the French royal army would be maintained historically, mostly by this lesser nobility that was a bit sandwiched between this kind of ambitious and demanding bourgeoisie, and a higher nobility that was ever smaller and more detached from these roles, and thus also creating a bad image for the nobility as a whole, whereas most nobility was not really, at least as far as the bourgeois perspective really was, right? Not because the nobility was doing anything particularly wrong, right? Even before the French Revolution, the costs of the French nobility were very small overall on the state. They had hardly anything to do with, per se, with the reason why, I don't know, France had contracted such a huge debt. That was mostly a problem of the same size of France, and yes, still a social system that didn't provide with necessary mobility to improve the situation, but also it was a matter of the cost of the same army, for example, that was somehow still needed to compete with Britain at that point, with other great powers, with wars that were really costly, and that showed how France was still somehow, of course, as any other power, vulnerable and needing resources, but needing some kind of more intense change that was radically brought by the revolution that could even not exist had, let's say, for example, the famine of the previous years had not occurred, or something like that. At least we could have had a completely different type of revolution, or maybe a different type of transition. So just to tell you how non-definitive things really are, and just think this from the perspective of those who are reforming the system. And consider the soldiers themselves. For the seriously wounded, for example, Louis XIV created the Hôtel des Invalides. In the video about the Dragonade, we have seen how still in Louis times the existence of barracks for hosting the troops was somehow a forefront concept. The same goes for economic assistance for the war wounded, for the veterans in general. Louis thought about this as well in a religious but still somehow redeeming ideology. Les Invalides has always this presence of gold that there is Louis IX's chapel, etc. So all symbols that were meant to, say, paternalize this enormous military fort and all those who remained unable in it. With this far-sighted reform, Louis XIV's France fostered a generation of military commanders of the highest caliber, right? If you think about it in comparison to the French Revolution over a century later, Napoleon and his marshals are certainly of greater fame today, but we must compare to Louis XIV's generals, but we must not forget that France in Napoleonic times suffered twice the shame of seeing Paris violated by enemy armies, while the generals of the Sun King always managed to avoid it. Right? They are little known, again, compared to other French marshals of the Napoleonic Wars, but again, figures like, at least Turenne is very famous, but don't think that his context is famous. Like, last year, I remember I made a video about Montecuccoli, and people told me, like, oh, really? I didn't know this was one of the greatest generals of the modern age. Never heard of him. I knew of Turenne, but this guy, no. Like, yeah, like, you know, again, the duel between Montecuccoli and Turenne is the only thing that, like, if you know anything about Turenne's military curriculum, that's literally the single most important thing. So what the hell do you know about Turenne? Or all these other kids that told me about, Maurice of Nassau, Gustavus Adolphus. Just, can you make a video about Frederick II? Do you know generals just because, you know, you attach them to a country because you're a fourth essayer that looks at random names of cool generals just because they're of their favorite football team? Or do you actually know anything about, scientifically, about the details of the military history of these commanders in the broader framework of the Western out of war? I mean, do you know exactly what Turenne did in his lifetime, or Condé, or Vauban, or Catinat? Right, these are all names that deserve a place of honor in the Empyrean of the greatest military commanders. And they are the Sun King's ones, and these do not receive, I think, all the appreciation or hype, or if not by those who, I don't know, love the Grand Siècle and know, of course, the names, and know maybe, of course, of the same Montecuccoli or Prince Eugene, or many other commanders over Europe at the time that really spent an existence molding this modern warfare really being expanded to unprecedented limits. And naturally, presenting these figures is not easy at all. Like, we can't just sum up their main exploit. Henri de la Tour d'Auvergne, Viscount of Touraine, 1611 1675, was, first of all, the most successful of all the 17th century French marshals, right? A master of maneuver warfare, especially. And he really belongs to another era. I mean, some of you exploit, like, for example, the defeat of the Bavarian Right, the Battle of Nordlingen, belonged both, in fact, to the 30 Years' War, right? The armies of France and Sweden also waged during the final stages of the war against the Imperial Bavarian Army an extraordinary amount of feats at Zusmarshausen, for example. At the very end of the war, Turenne overtook Raimondo Montecuccoli's retreating army and crashed its rear guard. Eventually, just to, as we were saying before, to realize how risky warfare really was, Turenne died struck by a cannonball at the Battle of Salzbach in 1675 during the Franco-Dutch War. So at that point, the command of operations was taken by Condé, but Louis XIV insisted that Turenne's body to be interred in the Abbey of Saint-Denis. So to have him placed, next to the burial of the French monarchs, which is to understand how much traditional tribute was given to the imperium still, and that, losing a general like that, of course, in spite of age, was a blow for the entire country. Then, as we've seen, there was the same Prince Louis II of Bourbon, known as Le Grand Condé, known for his very precocious military genius. At the age of only 22, he had defeated superior Spanish forces at the Battle of Rocroi, with an excellent, combined arms maneuver, but also all those Sardinian, cold blood capacity that this kind of warfare really required. The lists, like, even, for example, Turenne's battles, like, how many are they? I don't even know how many. We're talking about several tens of, like, you understand the curriculum of these people as something just a life spent in war, per se. Sébastien Leprestre de Vauban, 1633-1707, is again remembered for the greatest military engineer in the history of mankind, right? He simply took to another step siege techniques in the same military engineering, of course. There is also a minor civilian accomplishment that is often overlooked comparatively to the military one, but still considerable, actually. He perfected the system of the Italian bassinet track that had been dominating military engineering up to that point, and this new type of fortification naturally was meant to oppose the progress of artillery, right? That required an ever more stratified kind of and lower height type of fortification. There is Nicolas Catinat that we talked about before, 1637-1712, with part of that new bourgeoisie emerging and having a chance in the military. He was the son of a magistrate, and he began thus to study law himself, but at the first cause he undertook, he lost, and so he decided to join the military and became one of the most famous generals of his century. He began his military career actually in the guards of Louis XIV, rising through his merits to the highest rank as Marshal of France. He was actually defeated, for example, at Chiari and Carpi by Prince Eugene, but he also managed to score the victories of Staffarda and Marsaglia against Victor Amadeus of Savoy, right? So that's mostly an Italian front, and the figure is interesting because Catinat at the end of his life came just back to a very normal life, cultivating his vegetable garden, right, and after this highly respectable military career. And again, all these commanders displayed dramatic methodicism, practicality, cold blood, calculation, rationale. Like Napoleon's marshals were chosen from a wide array of profile types, and perhaps it's just a coincidence that Louis XIV were kind of all similar in this regard, but Napoleon's marshals were designed properly to be part of, like an extension of Napoleon's mind, right? It was also a probably aggressive one, like bold, courageous, in fact, daring one, right? And so you can argue Napoleonic marshals being more just impetuous and having earned a reputation for a system that required that, but at the same time was also the product of Napoleon. Louis XIV instead was the head of a state who chose talents, who in this sense preserved the state himself, contributing to the mold of a system and not just specializing in that one. So even from a strategic point of view, you must give that Louis XIV France seems paradoxically even more solid than Napoleonic France, right? In the broader scale also of literally of strengths of power, even though Napoleon there unlocked much greater forces that had ever been seen available. In a sense, everything was more approximate than it had been before on that scale, because it was definitely so big that the means to contain them were more difficult to create at the same time. So coming back to Louis, by establishing an officer corps with well-defined responsibilities and duties, a clear and indisputable chain of command and hierarchy was established, right? That reflected, again, this not just a military, but a political and social order. It was military rank and not social prestige of personal ties that determined who was to command and who to obey, right? Something that had never truly been brought on before. You can't avoid to see even in the fact meritocratic elements of the revolutionary armies 1 century later, an important royal legacy, right, set by Saint Louis XIV in that regard. So not everything is opposite practically, right? It's the ideological difference that makes the difference in many ways. Louis XIV's chain of command became the future operational principle of all armies, as the forms of warfare have changed many times since then, but military establishments still employ the same titles, adopt the same categories, and establish the same relationships established for 17th century French regiments. And it all started from there, also for the other countries. Do you hear that often? No, it must have been some kind of strange reform in still half mercenary, half militia system that nobody can explain, that has to bear memory of that. And never mind the French army of Louis XIV. With the reform of the Sun King, being an officer became a profession, the noblest of professions. This was also the ideology underlying this radical change. After all, the basic principle of Louis' army, in fact, and it would become for all one. So order, discipline, self-sacrifice, right? You can't have an effective command without order. You can't have an effective fighting force without discipline, and especially you cannot attain a victory without self-sacrifice. And so there are principles to which you have to be inspired. There are evidently the ones of a universal, a complete order that the monarchy there was providing the model of and the opportunity of being integrated in, from the highest nobility to the common soldier. We established de facto the first modern national army, a permanent professional statal force that all the Ancien Regime governments had strived to build, to achieve, at least in part, right? And instead was created for the first time in France by the Sun King, right? The difference being that other countries for a while kept using essentially just mixed troops, like some more permanent regiments paid directly by the monarchy, and mercenaries and militia, right? Instead, Louis de facto created this country, this French army. As a matter of fact, this is what gets down to the control of Louvois and of the king himself on the degree of efficiency achieved by such regiments was continuous and capillary, right? Louis had a precocious inclination towards military affairs. Since he was a kid, he ordered his servants to perform military marches. He always inspected the palace guards, controlling if every single button was okay. And he, even as an adult, dedicated hours and hours every day to assisting in the exercises and field maneuvers of his troops. And his example also drove the noble owners of the regiments to emulate him to gain his goodwill. Again, Louis was not a military talent as far as command was concerned, but as an organizer, a reformer, and a trainer, he was a huge mind. And he wrote in his memoirs, quote, "More battles are won by the good order and deportment of the troops than by sword and musket blows, and this habit of marching well and keeping order can only be obtained with training." Adding further, quote, "Good order makes us look safe, and it is enough to make us look brave, because very often our enemies don't wait for us to get close enough to force us to prove what we really are." This is beautiful because it shows you literally from the same words of the Sun King, how important discipline, order, and authority really were. And definitely Louis was embodying the top of that order. We have seen just recently in the video about the quality of Roman leadership, how the Roman emperor had to provide with literally a personal example. Right? Just think of Augustus, that also wasn't much of a commander himself. It was mostly Agrippa who made everything from him. But as far as the military reform that he enacted, and the example that he set, and the general order that he established, there are no comparisons. And in this sense, Louis, that was naturally a very different character, but did the same, military-wise. And the psychological effect that this impressive host, marching orderly with uniforms that were introduced also on a larger scale with all the system of regimental identification, but over a same national color at a point, it was very gradual, because these reforms weren't carried out overnight. Still, armies kept evolving even after Louvois did most of the thing done. But I made a video about the I think it's about some aspects of 18th century military uniformation, and the one on drums, trumpets, and flags or something like that, that explain you the psychological effect that such a uniformly trained and equipped and drilled army makes on the enemy. I mean, that the last phrase we quoted from Louis clarifies dramatically. It says, there is this psychological effect we make on the enemy, for which that is actually very strategic thought, because it says even, of course, coming to grips with the enemies, yet it's another thing, but you can do really a lot in a strategic measure, even if you just show how much quality and effort you put in drill, and how, in fact, orderly you can conduct yourself in front of the enemy. And I would say the two things overlap, because if you are trained that much, if you can perform these maneuvers rapidly, speedily, notoriously, the French army would maintain a double speed of march of the over the other European armies, just by sheer tradition, because again, this need of crossing huge distances on this large French frontier was incredibly important, and the French army always could perform that better than others, right? So it was just part of the French military culture at that point, to display this fine order. And the same von Clausewitz says that, of course, even those strategic actions that haven't taken place, but that you can imagine by knowing what the enemy can do, have per se a strategic weight. Because for a moral point of view, and given that war is just a clash between moral forces, knowing that your enemy has those capacities per se is just already a sheltered defense, which is what Louis is basically saying. And being aware of what it means to come close to the enemy in that regard. And you understand also how beautiful his prose is, how insightful his intuitions about warfare are. I mean, he had a pretty clear vision, after all, the meaning of imperial concreteness on the battlefield, right? He had seen his armies fighting with his own eyes very often. He was always there. It was an incredible boosting force. As we'll see now, Louis reformed the armies in everything, right? Also in the elimination of non-combatants, the wives and children of soldiers, as well as prostitutes, were taken out of the way. But let's say I'm very impressed by the modernity of the moral understanding of the sovereign, right? This permeated his view, not just militarily, but as we've seen, politically. The matter of taking control himself or ruling the country, not entrusting it to some corrupt people that would just use it for their own personal gain. The necessity of leadership, of a unitary measure for everything. He was incarnating himself, right? And this Clausewitzian view, in the eyes of Louis the XIV, that combat was above all a clash of wills from which the group with the highest spirit of sacrifice would emerge victorious, first of all, is a conviction that would take root in all European armies already at the time, and which represents an irrefutable dogma right up to the massacres on the battlefields of the Great War, where millions of men sacrificed themselves without hesitation. And as I was saying before, I don't have time to digress on the misunderstandings about World War I and other, and the nature of war in general, but it's relevant historically to point out how this mass spirit, essentially a national one, realizing what nation in this sense meant as essentially a unity of spirit, not a mere, um, in abstraction of a uniform blob that you fundamentally design on the base of some sort of linguistic or loosely ethnic connection without any other political, military, or social understanding like nationalism does. It does explaining, as we were saying before, just even in comparison with Napoleonic times, how more vulnerable even France got, the state got at that point, right? Not because it was not capable of unleashing power, but because it wasn't capable of, say, regulating, arguably, what would happen later, right, on the longer run. And this particular aspect is important because Louis was, in a sense, making the whole country functionalize to this great effort. So it was very important, we can say from a mass point of view, because the numbers start being impressive. I mean, armies of hundreds of thousands of men, as we've seen, were clumsily brought at this point in history in the early 18th century, and not to be seen fundamentally almost up to Napoleonic era, just out of sheer practical necessity, I mean, on the same battlefield. But the commitment, of course, was much greater at the time, you think about it. It's as if Louis XIV's time embodied the measure of traditional awareness compared to later times, when the nation state promised just that because you are of a certain group, you're fundamentally special, and so you can hope that the system will win, even if you personally don't do anything, or maybe you can do it but not seeing the wall from the outside. This also was a pretty hierarchical system, but at the same time it made clear what it meant to defend the interests of the country. That, yes, was still essentially limited to itself, but from a monarchic point of view, as we've seen, it had actually an imperial and universal scope that had hardly been limited. You can argue that France had worn out the most imperial and universal of all European polities in the Holy Roman Empire, from a historical point of view, but never forget what the French kings thought of themselves regarding that kind of imperial grandeur, in fact. Because this is often overlooked itself. This wasn't much just France per se, but it was a much greater universal value that even France was called to fulfill. This is the aspect, but under the guidance of an emperor. So not again actually in a statalistic or collectivistic sense. It was just an harmonious hierarchy that, however, for the sheer means that had unleashed, was ever more difficult and required much higher virtue to use, which, given the rates of power that France was habituated to, is something that is difficult to keep up with on the longer run. So through this, even the history of the French Royal Army, you can measure that degree of aging of the world. And the modernity of the concept of the clash of wills does have that straight connection up to the World War I, in the sense that throughout all this time it was considered perfectly normal to accept this idea, and the reason why is because it's right on a sheer strategic point of view. There is no other way to win wars but accepting this self-sacrifice. There is literally no other way. So the way, of course, we see massacres like the ones of World War I is becoming ever less understandable simply because we have been severed, especially from the realization of the political will that brought to those things to happen. And that was not the narcissism of the generals that were crazy butchers or whatever, but because the peoples literally understood the still, at least compared to nowadays even, loosely, but still, the benefits that would derive from crushing another country in battle. That should have been always self-evident, right? In the moment in which you do come at war, which is another matter to be decided, but when it does happen, like, war is not, like, doesn't make any sense. Like, it doesn't make any sense if politics, of course, makes you fight an unwinnable war. Because, yes, at that point, there is a disconnection between you and reality, but it's still your problem, right? But if you study, I don't know, the War of Spanish Succession, but you can hardly see there, like an absence of reason. Or even listening to Louis XIV's words, like, I loved war too much. Like, what does it actually mean? That those wars were not to be fought? That's not actually what the Sun King believed. He would have at least phrased it in a different way. And it's not even that the burden that he felt on himself was not, in this sense, felt with the greatest emotion, with the greatest power, exactly in the costly nature that self-sacrifice requires. So I would reflect very much on Louis XIV's legacy as far as properly Western strategic culture is concerned, because it's as if a sovereign had brought for the first time into a mass level his own principles, before the masses diluted tradition and lost the awareness of the sacred in their hearts, as it would happen later, and creating one of the single most successful militaries in the world. I think this is a huge merit, right? And using everyone, right? Giving a reason, an evident reason for everyone to participate into this, not imposing it per se, but making it work, because if you make it work by right motivation, people will make it happen much better than through imposition. So the diametrically opposite mechanism that we're brought to believe on average. As a consequence, also discipline was brutal, right? The Sun King's soldier no longer had time to idle. Every moment of his day was dedicated to a specific activity, in a routine that would be repeated day after day, year after year, until his death or his honorable discharge. The army became a family, essentially, with a strict but just and grateful father. Discipline was enforced even at the cost of cruel corporal punishment, but for the deserving there were prizes and career advancements. And as we've seen, those who had been seriously injured were entitled to treatment in the Hôtel des Invalides in Paris, reserved for veterans of the battlefields, as established of the Royal Edict of 1670, which read, quote, "For those who have risked their lives and shed their blood for the defense of the monarchy, so that they may pass the rest of their days in peace," which is a concept that, if you think about it, goes far beyond whatever we think of military veterans nowadays. Like, is there an equivalent to the Hôtel des Invalides in our world? And is there such a kind of paternal, affectionate, and spiritual concern, as much as that symbol really was? Like, you see, this is literally a duty and a reward at the same time. There was a broader cause to fight for. There was strict discipline, and really a brutal one that was, as we will see now, also causing very direct military consequence in campaign on the battlefields, because this meant that it's not much the corporal punishments that impressed, but what that discipline meant for the troops to act on the battlefield. The enormous increase in, for example, mortality among the French officers that became much higher than in the European armies, right? This is true exactly in the same way for eventually Frederick II's army. And there is a fil rouge that connects, of course, the French military standards there with also Frederick II. One of the greatest collaborators of Prince Eugene that had fought against the French was also one of the greatest influencers in Frederick II's Prussian military reforms. And in the 7 Years' War, the mortality among the Prussian officers was incredibly high. Literally, there was almost an estate wiped out. It also dramatically favored the decentralization of Prussia, that was actually one of the single most decentralized feudal kind of backwards country up to that point. And the Prussian troops earned the reputation of an unparalleled courage in the process. Well, the same happened, right, for the French under the Sun King, right, to a lesser scale, because at the end of the day, the French army was also pretty big, right? As we will see, as for the largest militaries, there wasn't even, military technology actually on the fore. The French infantry was one of the last ones of adopting the bayonet, even though it was invented in France. And this because, of course, when you have such huge numbers of troops, what you invest on mostly is the most effective, like the term of cost-benefit ratio standards that have to do with the overall discipline of the troops, even with sheer power at a point, but still evidencing how needed that is, even when obviously the individual quality is lower, because you can't invest too much in a single soldier. And this is not a compliment for the others, because it just means that there are minor powers and they're lucky they can attain such, even higher qualitative standards, and not on the collective scale the French can. So the way, of course, politics and wars occur is another story, because it's not strictly a military matter, right? Lots of things come into play, not just as war as an instrument of politics, but also politics and war being all one with society and so on. But we will see that perhaps on another occasion. But this sense of uniformity, of order, of courage, like made the French army definitely the top one, not just by size. Thanks to obsessive training, the troops acted mechanically, they obeyed their officers, and without the slightest hesitation. They had been given a reason, right? They had been trained because there were adequate commanders, because they were armed forces, not uniformed caravans, right? No detail was overlooked to achieve the goal. Before Louis XIV's reform, armies on campaign had a large following of non-combatants, as we've seen. The wives, children, soldiers, prostitutes, but also merchants, and anyone else who found it convenient to join the armies. In the name of efficiency and morality, too, the French armies abolished this practice, except for a small number of saddler and peddler to serve the troops, right? And a score of wives of good reputation, at least of the soldiers, as seamstresses, laundresses, and nurses, roles that were indispensable. So what did actually change? Well, the fact that most of the logistical system now was finally uniform. It may seem strange, but before the time of Louis XIV, no European army had done something such as considering how many supplies an army had to bring for an entire campaign, right? Or maintaining that flow steady, or in a scientific sense. It was, in a way, as simple as that. Finally having the means, through, as we will see now, also extensive economical reforms and tax assistance and beyond, administrative development, literally knowing this army has this amount of men. How much food does it need for a certain amount of time? How many food has to arrive to them in a certain, let's say in a day, in a week, right? And this was for the first time receiving an office in a state administration and being calculated for this. Right? Before, armies were also smaller. There was a reason why there was no need to spend extra money just to calculate something you could do just on the field. Now, you could not afford that anymore. And a great part of that system had been working thanks to the settler train, to the fact that there were, as we've seen, field aides, but also merchants would literally were subcontracted the supplying system, and that paid the troops in exchange for the loot. They would immediately thus monetize. At this point now, instead, the army took all care of it, or at least in a much more direct way. And so you could, of course, be assisted by, say, your wife, especially considered that the commanders were noblemen, so they could still bring with them servants. They had all certain privileges, right, in general. And it wasn't so strange up to the 19th century of having, I don't know, dames coming to look at a battle from the distance as a spectacle, right? Because in many ways it was still thought like that, especially this time. Like, war was the pastime of monarchs, was conceived like as a clash still between dynasts. The concept of nation, and this was just still alien in the contemporary sense of it, as if, it's not that there were much fighting because there were different peoples uniformed in color. As we've seen, France was just now being still consolidating with new conquests. The point was having a model of virtue, an example for the legitimacy of the order that the Sun King embodied in this regard. Of course, it goes without saying that Louis XIV is at least the greatest sovereign in modern era, and there is no doubt about this. If one compares the artistic representations of the armies of the first half of the 17th century with those of the era of the Sun King, well, he can definitely measure the difference of this different forms of organization and training and supplying. Because the paintings that portray idle soldiers and caravans and encampments piled up in confusion are typical of, say, the paintings of the 30 Years' War, are replaced, notoriously, by representations of men intent on training perfectly framed, fireplaces and tents aligned with an order that would have been the envy of the even disciplined Roman legions. There are pictures I inserted here, and some are somehow still quite landscape based, but if you look at the few encampments that you check there, well, you don't see anything like that in the first half of the 17th century. Everything perfectly ordered, aligned, a good geometry in the fortifications, properly a structure that you can perceive in the way these troops were deployed. And this basically had quite never been seen. I mean, here the order of standardized camps, of rigid discipline, etc. Something that, again, from the Renaissance, basing oneself on the classical sources, classical armies of Rome, especially, all the great rulers had kind of wanted to attain. Well, the French army of Louis XIV was the truly first one who managed to standardize it on a national level. Um, as a consequence of, by the way, the elimination of the saddler train, the regiments became exclusively male communities, which isolated their members from the social context to concentrate all their attention and time on the unit they belonged to. This was particularly powerful because, first of all, we have seen that one of the practice that starts this time is, first of all, to start literally emarginating the social scum, in a way, or all those who do not have means to support themselves. In part, they were, as we've seen, sustained with welfare system. Think about the Hôtel des Invalides in itself. But at the same time, it was a way to also separate them from the rest. In this proto-industrial phase, there are ever greater socio-economical imbalances, and while, say, in medieval times it was normal to see beggars pretty much everywhere in the streets, at this point communities wanted more order, right? More safety, more decorum, and so many people were not just confined in suburbs or internated in mental, say, inauspices of some sort, of depending on who they were. There was also much more say, reclusive handling of criminals, which is also something relatively recent in time, like to just put a person in jail. Before, states didn't do this because it would cost too much. They just either inflicted corporal punishment, or they killed people, or they confiscated their good. They didn't keep people in jail. Instead, this began to happen. And so also the army, as we've seen from other videos, for example, about the Navy, in that case in the 18th century, with good examples between France and Britain, you realize that probably this society left over, we can say, was even forcibly brought under in the army, right? Literally with the recruitment gangs that literally could even kidnap you, for forced recruitment and so on, especially targeting those elements of society that were less integrated, right? So concentrating also the scum of the earth in these regiments, but kind of forming them into real professional troopers. That, as you know, is a brutal experience where you have to systematically destroy a person and to rebuild him into a killing machine. And it's obvious that if armies were kind of more bivouacs with, still families around, etc., everything was not standardized. There was this kind of connivant, corrupt system, etc. The disciplinary standards were also pretty low. Now instead, if you wanted to, again, move those armies, especially on the battlefield, orderly and effectively, you needed also to train them in ways that, yes, as we've seen, entailed that continuous training, etc., but it had to be founded on a much, harder core, which discipline, in ever more violent way, was able to enforce. Like, discipline in this sense was harsher as the result of the increase of central authority that could enforce this, this violence on those who would disobey and, make an example for all the others. And this definitely brought, first of all, with the standardization of the troops, it was also sort of regimental identity, like even with the permanent element of the same, there was all a history being born of these units that would continue over time. And so an esprit de corps that revolved around the unit's tradition. But just being, again, living all together without being severed from the rest of society, the bond between the soldiers increased, was cemented, right? Loyalty to the regiment and to the king became a ghost on its own that would guide this man to battle, like literally the infantry, especially in the tonic capacity of essentially being hypnotized by the drums that in fact echo in your chest and bring you towards the enemy without even thinking, right? Whereas cavalry was more nobiliar, still had more like the idea of the trumpet, is more Apollinian, more elevated, right? And in fact, in also Louis XIV's musical times, let's say, there is a great deal of these differences that are articulated in an ever more complex and effective fashion. Right, the contrast between the Apollonian and the Dionysian is quite strong, and the troops definitely embodied the largely the infantry regiments, that the latter aspect. But there was a lot of still kind of equestrian Uranian obsession, right? Even with new elements coming from Central Eastern Europe of ethnic specialties that somehow would spread, like the Hussars, for example, began to appear exactly on these battlefields in the West for the first time. For this purpose of uniformity of recruitment, equipment, clothing, and organization, and also equality in economic and disciplinary treatment were introduced. A level playing field which further strengthened the sense of belonging, and that becomes the basis of the modern regiment with its history, its tradition, esprit de corps, all created in Louis XIV's army. The grey uniforms of the French infantry distinguished one regiment from another thanks to a precise color scheme. So the soldiers would recognize that, but still, in a broader sense, the enemy would just see this compact, homogeneous color to identify the infinity of the French army. Also, territorial recruitment was enhanced, which really strengthened mutual loyalty between soldiers and peasants and gave impetus to the cult of tradition and esprit de corps. This was one of the greatest achievements also of the reform, because France had always remained somehow distrustful of the territorial forces arming the peasantry, because they realized how dangerous it could be. And in fact, as we will see, this system was enormously difficult to keep up with over time. Like the French army became huge and costed enormously. But at the same time, this previous mindset had been surpassed, because literally, in fact, the sovereign had managed to, for the first time in French history, bring the nobility under and countering it further through the creation of a peasant force. So this, in a sense, would increase the threat of a revolution. But as long as the state could provide, first of all, with an opportunity for these people in some way, and the nobiliar element that was still overwhelmingly powerful could be channeled in this kind of unitary direction, well, the system could hold, and would hold, in fact, for a considerable amount of time, considering that this was also the first time it ever happened, and that still even the French Revolution brought to a further stabilization of the political institutional basis, so that there wasn't like a reverse to feudalism once again at any point, right? So France got it right in the broader scale of thinking, again, through the mind essentially of one man, because this man literally created this out of scratch. He reigned, as we've seen, for more than half a century, and he changed Europe as it had objectively never occurred by scale. Other systems had fundamentally maintained themselves because they were more fragile, but they were even more epochal changes. But they were never so fast, right, and stabilized by like these ones. As we were saying before, just even the French Revolution was speedier, but it lasted even less. Older orders, including the same ones with the Capetian monarchy, had been much more long-lasting. So everything seems to happen faster and less, in a less controllable way the more you go on. But it also stems from the will of taking the next step, of literally enacting a system that has an evident immediate advantage. Because without these achievements, France would have likely been exposed to some resizing, or at least to a much greater fragility that who knows what consequences could have brought, which powers could have favored the rise of compared to others who were squeezed. That at the same time, the strength of France obliged the other European countries to strengthen themselves as such as well. The France of Louis XIV was therefore equipped with the most modern war machine of the time, thanks also to its large population. As we were saying before, in a few years, in 1667, Louis troops reached 125,000 units. So that's how fast it escalated before even reaching the greatest one later, as we will see. And for the act of the conquest campaigns foreseen by Louis XIV, namely the War of Devolution against the alliance between Holland, Spain, England, and Sweden, well, more than 100,000 men was already at the time, and even against this array of foes, considered a huge army. So over the years, the whole Europe reacted, coalescing against France, which responded by mobilizing in turn and arming at an average 300,000 men. As we've seen, 240,000. There was actually a moment peak of 450,000. That includes, remember, also the garrisons, etc. So this was an extraordinary figure that was never reached again until the Napoleonic Wars. This is again to tell you how modern the French army was already. Again, in that intuition, you see, Napoleonic era was, as we have learned, the age of von Clausewitz, the one that had sparked those ideas, military theories in the first place. The artifacts of this was writing exactly what von Clausewitz was to eventually lay out in a more systematic and scientific way. But essentially, that war is that clash between moral forces in the essence, and managing to transpose this also in not just in his military reforms, but in the order given to an entire state. This gigantic effort, however, was not only too onerous in the long run for the French economy and society, but it was not even sufficient to win against the united forces of the whole Europe. This should also make us understand how limited all these endeavors are compared to a ideal infinite, let's say. Of course, France could mobilize all these forces, but then, yes, she was surrounded by enemies. And the sunset of the Sun King cast, as we have seen, this melancholic shadow on his disappointed ambitions. Because if it had depended on him, things would have definitely had to go far beyond the important territorial acquisitions that France maintained, even in great part till to this very day. So at least in that sense, succeeding. But if you look at it, it's practically just some acquisitions in a frontier area that are maybe today in perspective not so so even huge to our eyes, at least. What we don't understand if we reason like this is how big was the effort in relative terms for a country of those dimensions to even succeed in that enterprise, in managing to break through that mold of incredibly intertwined powers that doesn't matter how composite they were, but exactly for that could unite, disunite, essentially adapting to the type of enemy they were fighting. And that's why the entire Europe went at war against the Sun King. And managed to withstand that. So this is also a pretty interesting example of how in history, like whenever a power mobilizes, it's not really, as we think today, allegedly post-Westphalian times, and now we're coming back to sort of before, like all these categoristic abstract ideologies. Whenever there is a war, like you realize that there is a concentration of power from whatever the range that is possible to attain, and that whichever war is fought can show you concretely what is the measure, the limits of an age, of a time, of a power, right? So France, of course, had this limit. Altogether, she wasn't stronger than the rest of Europe, and even just another part of Europe, there wasn't. All the rest was enough to at least check her ambitions, though, and with great difficulty, because France would never lose that power de facto again, at least, if not temporarily, but significantly, at least in the Franco-Prussian War, also, with the crushing of Napoleon, but say in the Second World War, but maintaining still the fact that it was a French state and never disintegrated. In Louis XIV's time, that was not to be given for granted, because even just episodes like the Fronde had proven that pretty messed up things could actually occur. This is an interesting topic also to debate in general that we can't do today because of matters of time, but consider first of all what the same Louis XIV foresaw here, that is to say, outlining the horizon, that deluge that would submerge the old regime after him, and attributing this precisely to his irreducible and uncontainable love for war. So the question that people often ask is, did this French achievement under the Sun King trigger the same French Revolution later? Well, of course, like it was one of the triggers, at least, it set the premises for at least what we have known as the political institutional form, and also the military of revolutionary France would be, right? But it did it in however, in ways that could be prevented. If the question is, did automatically Louis XIV make the French Revolution? No, this is wrong, right? This is wrong because, as always, it doesn't take in consideration all the things that could literally go in another way, including literally different heirs to the French throne, so completely different political strategic approaches. Maybe, I don't know, the revolution could have even broken out earlier than it did. But if you understand how it happened, de facto in 1792 rather than 1789 even, which that's also a bit too notionistic. Well, you realize the French Revolution could happen in many other ways. First of all, it could happen also in other countries. Let's say, of course, not with the same influence that eventually would have had for the world, as opposed to the French one. But let's say it's something that depends on contingencies that at the moment of Louis' death in 1715 you can't really say would have occurred at some point, right? And there is, if you want just history telling you how these things can go, even just think about the Restoration. Did you ever think about this? The Restoration occurred exactly 100 years after Louis XIV's death. That means that there was somebody 100 years old that had been born, that had been living through the events that had brought to eventually this ultimate attempt to bring Europe to the Ancien Regime by some degree, even though already so much had formally changed by the same restorers. So this is a very interesting topic, but let's say it suffers as a question, at least as of a deterministic prejudice that is not true. What is true, of course, is that, as always, modernization must be handled, right? Modernity is not bad per se. And the greatest civilization in the history of mankind were the ones who were successful in combining tradition and modernity successfully. In other words, we could pick the best of both tradition and modernity, staying away from the worst of them at the same time. And if you look at them, they're all like this. And Louis the 14th France is this. Because again, as I was saying at the beginning of the video, we tend to see his reign as the apex of absolutism. But it's actually not true. At least nobody considers the nation state absolutism, because people just repeat names and don't even understand their meaning anymore. But Louis XIV, as powerful as he was not really absolute in power. If anything, for a political, juridical reason, right? The same essence of the Ancien Regime is not compatible with absolute power, because this, even traditionally, doesn't quite exist. And especially even in the absolutism that in this sense would be proper for the nation state is not technically, it's already, say, cut down not to an imperial universal scale, but to a nationalistic socialistic one, which is basically the denial of any broader achievement. With the Sun King we have actually the mindset of a monarch born and raised in a typical first half of the 17th century context, with a actually very say a limited monarchic power, with the historical inexistence of the type of state that the same Louis would have created, so that it literally had never been seen before. So it was a creation of his, we can easily say. Still a word of confessional idealism. It doesn't matter whether France was the first one during the 30 Years' War to break that by, say, signing with the Protestants as a Catholic power. But still, just think about Louis XIII. I mean, Louis' father, it was a completely different man, a typical one of his time. Louis created that time. So he created that by realizing that even modernity is a universal direction, right? But being able to wield it from a purely traditional base. Louis wasn't a revolutionary. It's not that he showed any particular sympathy for the people, or even the soldiery per se, right? It was a role, a God-given one that had made kings ruling earth and within, a frame in which they could also inspire to a greater heroic fate, right? And this was still felt like I can do it. And many reactionaries say, but France is exactly the country where this modernity spread the earliest, because of these people that essentially created monarchy as an empty shell. Well, I think in terms of traditional imperial power, this is completely wrong. Actually, Louis literally created an age on its own, and it's rather later, and so with an unprecedented display of real power, that is all which this values base themselves on. It's rather the collapse of his successor. Of course, this as I was saying before, it's hard to wield something of this kind, and you, in this sense, Louis outperformed, let's say, the system that he created, and people rested on it, so they grew softer. But it's their problem, right? And the fact that, of course, also the Ancien regime has been hated purely by, of course, not just the revolution, but anyone who had also different institutional or political culture than the French one as it was developing. Like, would we consider Louis XIV the same way? The Enlightenment, at least as we have known it, with its bad and good sides, would have not existed. Right? Everything is also narrative. It's difficult to find a for example, my own personal interpretation of Louis XIV's reign, because it's all very controversial, right? And that's why you can just make videos of this type. At some point you have to be more consistent, and we will have to enter into details of Louis XIV's history and also warfare. All right. I would like actually to conclude this video just by adding something on, actually a name that here we skipped completely, at least in the essence, because it doesn't belong to the military environment. But as we were saying before, it could have not been done if socially, politically, he had not achieved what he did. And of course we were talking about the aforementioned Jean-Baptiste Colbert. There was the Controller General of France from 1665 until his death in 1683. And I think there is no doubt that without his reforms to the France of Louis XIV would have not had the basis it had, or the resources or the possibilities. Colbert was an excellent and tireless administrator. To him, Louis XIV owes the economic recovery of his kingdom and the procurement of the immense resources necessary to his military projects. This is, of course, self-evident. As we were talking about logistics before, we realized that Colbert's influence extended to every sector of activity that had even the slightest economic implication. So anything from incentives to industry and commerce, to attention to cultural, technological and scientific development. Then the greatest power in Europe, the most updated military, cannot avoid to have. As a matter of fact, as we were saying before, Louis XIV's army was, say, on everything except for technology. But of course, there was a dramatic development in military engineering per se, even in artillery, and even in the engraving Ultima Ratio Regum, famously enough, on Louis XIV's cannons. You can understand how far these even technical means were conceived to be properly the king's. And so part of this enormous divine enterprise, right? However, even Colbert, his genius and his dedication, another very clever, capable individual, were not enough to find the resources necessary to pay the costs of the war Louis XIV. So, at the king's death, the economic conditions of France were far from prosperous. Colbert was much more than a finance minister, right? He was responsible for the economic doctrine known as Colbertism and mercantilism. He developed, let's say, colonial production. He ensured much greater, say, fluidity with trades with the East, with also the French companies who were involved in that business. He created enormous textile industries. He replaced the Venetian glass industry with, say, the national one in France. He established even in agriculture, there were important reforms. Everything was, of course, designed to support the military effort. And without Colbert, France could have not even attempted her enormous expansion activity. The aspect here, which is, however, relevant, is, as we were saying, that the economic resources were not enough at the end of the day, and the reason being, of course, that war had an enormous toll, of course, in the same resistance of the Allies on what was at stake, right? So in a way, it's as if the two sides managed to counterbalance each other, and while countries like Britain or the Netherlands had somehow greater, say, pull from an economic point of view in relative terms, Colbert was responsible, for example, for the development of a French navy as well, which had to counter the Dutch, the British one. This was crucial, as you understand, also given the proximity of the countries. There was an important degree of kind of bombardment, a coastal bombardment from the various navies and so on. For not talking about the colonial interconnections, like the routes, the necessity of a navy that could maintain the fatherland connected with the various dependencies. But France was primarily a continental power, and she would maintain this role as Britain would evolve to control the seas, as you know. Nobody would beat France in that first role, right? Not, however, as France also could beat the others at sea. And this aspect, of course, speaks of a balance that is the same one that you see, say, battling still at the time of the War of American Independence, or the Napoleonic Wars themselves. That was something that remained in the history of the various national military traditions of the various countries. And so we don't even talk about them nowadays, but there would be so much to address regarding the work of each and every one of these figures, whether we're talking about Louis XIV or Louvois or Colbert or all the various generals that contributed to Louis' success, but also at a point were defeated as well by the reaction of the other powers. These videos are always longer because I address certain topics that are, I think, so big that cannot be resumed in any way, so that I should make smaller ones. But whenever I make more thematic ones, I notice people don't really watch so much, so at least I think I have to make basic ones that can kind of get the deal a bit, but also paving the way for the smaller ones, at the same time, because in finding this compromise, because otherwise the channel can't quite go on in the same way. Well, I think, however, that I would like to say something more royally worth for as a conclusion of Louis XIV's, the Sun King's military accomplishments video. I could just say that this figure to me is one of the single most important ones in history. I was very interested in him since I was little, and his entire existence is worth studying because none of his life aspects, let's say, is disconnected from this entire endeavor, right? And thus it cannot be simply say, okay, well, this is not so important, this is just a minor figure, or here we're talking about setting the establishments of modern military standards. And it can't be just, reduced to something less than this, right? There is an enormous merit which is demands, right, and not somebody else's, because again, if it hadn't been for him, surely France would have gone on in similar directions, but not necessarily with the same accomplishment that would eventually make her the first military model in 18th, 19th century Europe. So this, I think, is the greatest legacy you can observe, and even you can observe the intelligence and the understanding of Louis towards the most intimate nature of the military intercourse, as von Clausewitz would put it, and especially about the clash of moral forces, self-sacrifice, and this still traditional element that modernity eventually has tried to dilute on purpose in its negative accomplishments, and that instead indicated the necessary virtue that without discipline, as we've seen many times, cannot keep the system holding. So never confuse, let's say, the various contributions to this, the subtle differences, the double thread that always exists between within and between tradition and modernity, respectively, right? And that must always be handled, because the knowledge of it is the key for any civilizational success, and also the courage of naturally undertaking this enterprise. For today, however, I stop it here. I forgot to wish you a happy new 2023 at the beginning of the video, but I do, because this is the first video of the year. For today, however, I stop it here. I just hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it. Otherwise, leave a like or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming content. And for now, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time and see you next time. Bye.